So we encourage you to make your thoughts and questions known during the webinar and use the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen or possibly the top like it is on my iPad to submit your questions. And the presenters and facilitators will address as many questions that we can at the end of the webinar as time allows. So you'll also be provided an evaluation at the end of the webinar. So please do complete it. It helps us. And give your honest thoughts and recommendations. So as we move into the introductions, I just first want to thank and acknowledge BJA and especially John Markovic for their support and his leadership in the body-worn camera program for making events like this possible. I know John's going to have some comments at the end of the closing of the webinar, but just wanted to extend our appreciation. So let me turn to the topic in the introductions and turn over to the panel. So we're going to be talking about takeaways and key trends in the body-worn camera policy and practice based off 6 years of analysis. And as we know, and from my experience in working with the program, it's not just a simple technology. It can have tremendous benefits and impacts, and it's continually adjusting and evolving over time. So our expert panel is going to touch on multiple aspects of the analysis from what lessons learned and things they took away. And I'm sure you'll find this very interesting. So let me introduce the panel now, and I'll start with Dr. Michael White. Dr. White serves as the co-director on the body-worn camera TTA program and is a professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. Mike is an associate director of ASU's Center for Violence Prevention and Community Safety. And Mike is at the top of my list always as a go-to person for all body-worn camera-related topics and expertise. Next, we have Mark Smith, and Mark is a grant program administrator for the Colorado Springs Police Department. And prior to moving into his current position, Mark was a police officer with Colorado Springs for 35 years. He retired as the department's senior deputy chief in December of 2020. And our last panelist is Inspector Cecilia Ashe. Inspector Ashe has served with the Wilmington Police Department for 14 years and is currently assigned as the Inspector of Operations. She was instrumental in the development and implementation of Wilmington's Real-Time Crime Center, which was the first in the state of Delaware. She has over 24 years of law enforcement experience, including time as a police officer in Arlington County, Virginia. So you can see from that background, we have some expert panelists here. So again, thank you all for joining, and I'll now turn it over to Dr. Mike White to lead the presentation. Mike?
Thanks, Tom. As Tom said, my name's Mike White. So what I want to do for at least the first 15 minutes of this webinar is just provide a little bit of background on the body-worn camera policy review process that we have in place. Then I'm going to talk about some highlights of findings from the sixth edition of a policy analysis that we've done. The report, which will be out in the coming weeks, has much more detail. I'm just going to hit some highlights, tease you a bit with the findings. And then I'll turn it over to my co-presenters from Colorado Springs and Wilmington, who are going to talk about their own experiences with some of these challenging policy issues. So if you're familiar with this TTA program, maybe you're a grantee, you know that the policy review process that we've developed is a foundational piece of the entire program. And the review process that we've designed, that we've used for 7 years now, is focused on ensuring that grantee agencies have a comprehensive policy in place. And I'll talk a bit about the policy review scorecard in a minute that we've designed to help that. But this is an important process. In fact, release of funding to the grantee agency is tied to completing this process. And like I said, it's collaborative. The grantee agency works with our team to make sure all of the important issues are addressed in the policy, and we move to get agencies through this as quickly as possible. But again, the foundation here is that the policy is an important foundational part of the body-worn camera program. So I mentioned the policy review scorecard, and this is not sophisticated. In fact, it is an Excel spreadsheet, and it's publicly available. And this is the tool that we use to assess comprehensiveness. The scorecard covers 9 different areas of body-worn camera policy. Here on this slide, you see the policy development area. There are a total of 36 specific issues that are covered in the scorecard, and you can see it's kind of just a checkbox, yes, if this is covered. You'll notice that some of the issues are red, and there are a handful in this policy development area that are red. That means they're mandatory. That means that BJA has determined that these issues are of such critical importance, they must be covered in policy if the agency is going to complete this review process. And as I said, there are 13 of those mandatory issues. The other important point that I want to make with this scorecard review process is that, as I said before, it's focused on comprehensiveness. It is not prescriptive. It's not directional. BJA, our team, we're not telling agencies what they must specifically say on a given policy issue. Rather, we're just providing guidance on the issues that should be covered. I like to use one example to illustrate this very important point. And let's use the example of citizen notification. So what does your policy say? What kind of guidance does it give to officers about whether citizens should be notified that they're being recorded? And it's an important issue. It's a mandatory item in the scorecard. So it's a red item. And we've generally seen that there are three options that agencies choose from. The first is mandatory. Some agencies make it mandatory that the notification occurs. The language is, it uses the word shall. You shall notify. Usually there's something about practicality and officer safety, but it's mandatory. And that approach is fine. That gets a yes on the checkbox for that mandatory item. But other agencies, they don't want to make it mandatory. They recommend. So their policies will say, we recommend that you notify, but it's not required. That's fine too. And that'll get a yes on the checkbox for that particular item. Other agencies simply say, you are not required to notify, and that's also fine. That's what I mean when I say we're focused on comprehensiveness, but we're not being prescriptive. Any of those 3 very different positions on this policy issue are good to go, and we would pass muster. So it's up to the agency working locally with, internally with their stakeholders, externally with the community and others to determine the specifics of the policy language. This whole process is just focused on comprehensiveness. Here you see the 9 different areas that are covered by the scorecard. Obviously, policy development, I showed you that was number 1. Our guiding principle here is at the top of this slide. We believe that good body-worn camera policy will lead to good body-worn camera practice. And that's our mantra. That's what guides us in this program. So that's just a little bit of background on the review process that we've designed. And let's move into then the actual policy analysis. And because this program is not prescriptive in terms of the language, that means we see variation. Agencies take different positions on citizen notification or activation or officer authority to review. And the policy analysis that we're going to talk about is really focused on just looking at those trends. Over time, what are agencies deciding with regard to some of these issues? As I mentioned, this is the 6th edition of this policy analysis. We've now reviewed 447 agency policies that are part of this report. A couple of points on this. The 447 are most, but not all of the agencies that have been funded in this program. And you can see the breakdown by year. And what we've done is usually at some point in the year, we kind of draw that line in the sand and say, okay, we're going to review all of the agency policies that have completed the process as of this date. So it's most, but not all of the agencies, the vast majority though. The other point to keep in mind is that the findings that I'm going to talk about reflect policy positions at the time the agencies completed the review process. So any changes that they may have made in policy subsequently down the road are not reflected here. This is a snapshot of where policies are at the time they complete the policy review process in each of the funding years. This just shows the geographic distribution of those 447 agencies that are in this review. And if you were to look at a map of all of the funded agencies in this program, it would look very similar, and you can see where the concentrations of these agencies are. Okay, so let's get into the actual policy analysis. And I thought what I would do here is just highlight some of the key themes, again, just to give you kind of a snapshot, if you will, of some of the findings that we're seeing, some of the trends that we're seeing, and then you can go to the report when it's released in a couple of weeks for additional detail. So let's dig in and talk about what we found. And this is the report. As I said, there's a link here, and the report can be downloaded or viewed at this link in the next few weeks. These are the issues that are covered in the policy analysis, and we focus on 11 specific issues. And in the report, you'll see from these 11 issues, we've identified 22 policy trends. And it's those 22 policy trends that really reflect the meat of the report and tell us and tell the readers kind of where agencies are coming down on these issues that you see in this slide. So let's get into it then. So like I said, I'm just going to run through some of these trends that we're seeing, give you a taste, and then we can hear from our colleagues in Colorado Springs and Wilmington on their thoughts about these issues and some of the challenges that they've dealt with when working on body-worn camera policy. So the first issue is activation. And what we've seen consistently over the years is just about every single agency has a policy language that specifically tells their officers when they must record, when they must activate, and when they're prohibited from doing so. So that is very, very common, which is a good thing. So it provides very strong guidance on mandated circumstances as well as prohibited circumstances for turning the camera on. Deactivation, turning the camera off. One of the things that we've seen very consistently over time is that agencies give officers some flexibility in that decision to turn it off under certain circumstances. And if you look at the report, you can see what kinds of circumstances those are. Usually it involve maybe a citizen asking for the camera to be turned off or other kinds of situations. But discretion in deactivation is very, very common. Another trend that we see that is very, very common is allowing supervisors to review footage as part of internal investigations. So a citizen complaint is filed or there's a use of force, it's captured on the camera. The vast majority of agencies that have been funded in this program view the body-worn camera footage as valuable evidence that will facilitate the completion of that investigation. So I mentioned discretion in the deactivation decision being very, very common. This slide, we see discretion in the activation, that is discretion in the decision to turn the camera on. And you can see an example of policy language at the bottom of this slide. So this comes into play when, an officer is in a circumstance that, the policy doesn't mandate that the officer turn the camera on. It's not a prohibited circumstance. So it's neither one of those two. Does the officer then have discretion to make a decision to activate or not? And again, the policy language at the bottom is a good example of that. If the officer believes it's reasonably prudent to do so, then it's at his or her discretion to do so. And you can see that, this is something that has increased fairly consistently over time from about 60% during the first year of the program to up to 83% of agencies are giving officers that discretion in activation. So a fairly consistent increasing trend in this particular policy issue. I mentioned citizen notification when I was talking about the policy review scorecard. And what we see here is the percentage of agencies that make that notification mandatory, that they use that shall language in their policy about notifying citizens. And you can see, consistently, the majority of agencies that have been funded in this program do not make that mandatory. It is much more common to see the kind of language that you see at the bottom of this slide, that shall language. Again, if you look at the percentage by year, it wiggles a little bit, but generally it's right around 20%. So that means 80% of agencies have not made that notification mandatory. Rather, they fall in the recommended kind of language or what you see at the bottom of the slide. Another issue that's important is officers' authority to review their own footage. And I'm going to talk about that in two different ways. First, what I call routine review, which means, at the end of the shift, as an officer is completing reports, or perhaps they're getting ready for court testimony, are they allowed to review their footage to assist with those activities? And some example policy language at the bottom here. But if you look at the percentages by year, you can see that this is really, really very common. The vast majority of agencies funded in this program allow that kind of routine review among officers for reports and court preparation, that kind of thing. The other aspect of officer review of their own footage that I wanted to talk about briefly is a critical incident review. So an officer is involved in a shooting. The officer has a body-worn camera. The body-worn camera captures what happens. What is the sequence of events in terms of reviewing footage and making a formal statement? Obviously, the officer is going to have to make a formal statement about that shooting. Is the officer permitted to review the footage of the shooting before making a statement? And here you see at the bottom an example of policy language that allows that review before making a statement. And you can see in the early years of this program, 2015, 16, 17, that was exceptionally common. The trend was simply, yes, officers can review the footage before they make a formal statement. But what's interesting is over the last 2 years of the program, we see a fairly significant drop where an increasing number of agencies, percentage of agencies are requiring the officer to make the statement first, and then they can view the video after. And this has been a really controversial issue. There are persuasive arguments on both sides. If you ask me, the memory researchers really feel very strongly, psychologists, there should be no review beforehand. But here you see the trends that are occurring. Another trend that's changed a little bit over the last couple of years, I mentioned supervisor review of footage for administrative investigations. Here we see supervisor review for general performance evaluation of their subordinate officers. And you can see that this has changed over time. During kind of the middle years of this program, it became very common for supervisors to be permitted to do this. It's still common, but you can see a fairly significant drop over the last 2 years. So it'll be interesting to see if that trend continues. The last thing I wanted to talk about with regard to the trends that we're seeing are a handful of issues that consistently are not covered in body-worn camera policy. And some of these are fairly controversial. So, after George Floyd's death in May of 2020, there were demonstrations, First Amendment protected demonstrations across the globe. And in many cities throughout the United States, police responded to many of those demonstrations. Many of those police had body-worn cameras. It turns out, at least among the agencies that are funded in this program, more than 3/4 don't have any language in their policy that provide guidance on the use of body-worn cameras at those public demonstrations. A similar percentage also don't have anything in their body-worn camera policy with regard to muting of audio. This became controversial back in 2018 with the shooting death of Stephon Clark in Sacramento. And after that shooting event, the officers had muted the audio. And still, the majority of agencies, the policies that we've looked at here do not address whether it's appropriate or permitted to do that muting. The next two have to do with auditing. It's really common for agencies to have policy language that mandates that supervisors do some sort of auditing. Oftentimes, this is simply looking for compliance with body-worn camera policy. Are they activating when they're supposed to? What's not common is guidance on how supervisors should do that. You can see most of the policies that we've looked at do not tell supervisors how many videos they should review over a period of time or how those videos should be selected. And then over the last 2 years, we've really been focused on a controversial issue. It involves the public release of footage that's captured a critical incident like a shooting. And the backdrop here, the state of California about 2 years ago passed a law that requires every agency in the state to publicly release the footage of a critical incident within 45 days of the event. And so we've been looking at policy over the last 2 years to see if this is something that's becoming increasingly common, and it's not. California stands alone in many ways. The vast majority of policies that we've looked at over the last 2 years do not have anything specific about public release of a critical incident footage. Either the policies don't say anything at all, or they say something along the lines of we'll make a decision on a case-by-case basis. Just, wrapping up, again, the report will be available soon and you can get a whole lot more detail. We're seeing lots of consistency over time in some issues, but not all. Some things are changing. I want to reiterate a couple of important points. There is no one-size-fits-all policy. What works for Colorado Springs may or may not work for Wilmington, Delaware. And that's the way it is. The policy language should be determined locally by the agency with the relevant stakeholders. The other thing that's clear is that policies can't be static. Policies covering body-worn camera issues need to be reviewed. They need to be updated. They need to be changed as the program develops and evolves. And the other trend to keep in mind is that a number of states are passing legislation. They're passing laws that specifically deal with body-worn cameras. I think 10 states now have passed laws that mandate all the officers in their state to carry a camera. In some cases, that new legislation gets into specifics about retention and public access to footage and activation. And agencies really need to stay up on top of things to make sure that their policy is in compliance with any new state law that's been passed. So I think that's all I have. I'll kick it over to Mark from Colorado Springs, and he can talk about some of the experiences that they've had.
Thanks, Mike. very interesting to say the least. I can't say I saw much in there that was terribly surprising to me, but there were a couple of things that jumped out at me that we're facing here in Colorado Springs, not just in Colorado Springs, but in Colorado in general. So I'd like to touch on two things that in a little bit more detail that you talked about, and that is the impact of legislative mandates on our policy. And then secondly, kind of how we've dealt with the issue of officers being authorized to view their body-worn camera footage connected specifically to internal investigations and critical incidents like officer-involved shootings. First, I'll talk a little bit about in Colorado, we faced a pretty aggressive set of police reform measures, and there's a lot of debate about how well those were written and how much law enforcement input there was or wasn't allowed during that process. But I think it's accurate to say that part of the issue that we'll face here in Colorado is that the laws that have been passed are difficult to interpret. It's hard to write a policy when you can't get lawyers to agree on what the requirements of the state statute is. Specifically, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the coming law. It doesn't go into effect until next year. At least that's the opinion of most people. There are lawyers in our city that think some of the provisions of the body-worn camera law that was passed here in Colorado are in effect now, despite the fact that it doesn't mandate wearing body-worn cameras until July of next year. But specifically, I'd like to talk about the fact that it has some very interesting components around activation of body-worn cameras, the consequences for failing to activate body-worn cameras, and then around the release of body-worn camera footage. Despite the fact that it's not mandatory, most of the provisions of the statute yet, we've made a policy decision here in Colorado Springs to start incorporating what we know is coming next year into our policy rather than wait until it goes into effect. We think that, it's going to take a while for officers to develop new habits, particularly with respect to some of the things that are mandated around activation of the body-worn camera, which was frankly a little bit more broad than we had in our policy, at least initially. And on that topic, I'll just say that when we drafted our initial version of our policy back in 2016, this was an area mandating activation that we probably didn't flesh out as well as we should have. We were frankly disappointed to see that body-worn cameras weren't being activated in situations where they should have been on more of a regular basis than we would have liked. And so as we've done subsequent revisions of our policy, we've tightened that up considerably. And I guess my suggestion to other agencies who may be launching into that process is to specify that particular component right up front. Don't rely on the goodwill of people to just do the right thing because you may be disappointed down the road, as we were on that. I'd like to talk about what our state law says. Basically, it says any peace officer that interacts with the public has to wear a body-worn camera, has to be provided with one. So that's pretty much anybody from the chief on down. So that's a new thing, particularly in our department. The requirements for activation have been pretty much laid out specifically in state law now here in Colorado. So there's not a lot of wiggle room in policy when it comes to that anymore. But what's particularly interesting about our state law that's coming next year are the consequences for failure to activate. And that is that if an officer fails to activate their body-worn camera in a situation that's required by state law, it creates what they call a rebuttable presumption of inadmissibility. And what that means is any statements or conduct that would have been introduced through a police officer in a subsequent prosecution are deemed to be inadmissible with one exception, and that is if the prosecution can demonstrate that there was an equipment malfunction. And that only applies if you can also prove that the officer checked the functionality of their body-worn camera equipment at the start of their shift. And so it's pretty narrow. So you can imagine there is no life-saving, activity exception. An officer pulls up to an assault in progress, bails out of their car to go take action, forgets to turn their body-worn camera on. There's no exception for that. It kind of puts our officers in a position of having to remember the camera as opposed to taking immediate action. And there was also something written into the statute called the permissive inference of misconduct. And what the law says is that if the officer fails to activate their body-worn camera, that it is assumed that the reason that was done was because the officer was engaged in misconduct. So you can tell that's a pretty interesting approach for a state law to take with respect to the activities of police officers. And what's difficult in this particular situation is an inadvertent inactivation by an officer in an emergency circumstance could have a real impact on the victims because of the inability to bring that type of evidence into the prosecution. The officer simply couldn't testify about anything they did, saw, heard, or anything along those lines. Another interesting component of it is with respect to an intentional failure to activate a body-worn camera. Officers here in Colorado will potentially face the permanent revocation of their peace officer certification. Again, a serious, serious consequence. I don't think most law enforcement, I'll say all law enforcement agencies in Colorado probably have any problem with consequences for the intentional failure to not activate their body worn camera. However, this idea that the only plausible explanation or rebuttal that we can offer is an equipment malfunction for any other reason that the officer didn't activate their camera is problematic, to say the least. One other area I'd like to touch on just quickly are the provisions of our coming statute around the release of body worn camera footage. And to say the least, it's complicated. I don't know if you can see this. I'm gonna try to hold this up for just a second. This is an 11 by 14 piece of paper that our legislative liaison, who's one of the smartest ladies I've ever met, took a shot at trying to interpret when and how body worn camera footage can be released, under what circumstances is it required, when is it prohibited, and it is complicated. It's been a very big challenge because we can't get attorneys to agree on what that statute says or even when it goes into effect necessarily. So one of the things we did here in Colorado Springs is we formed an internal committee that typically consists of one of the deputy chiefs, our legal advisor, our body worn camera evidence technicians, members of our victim advocacy unit, our legislative liaison, and our records manager to review body worn camera release circumstances that come to our attention. Not so much the routine things, but they meet regularly to try to address those things that fall outside the norm. And I want to note that's something we did before the passage of the statute that will go into effect next year. We just thought it was worth considering a lot of different viewpoints as we set policy around when body worn camera footage would be released, and wanting to make sure that we got all of the various experts in our department weighing in on that issue. And that's something that I would suggest agencies consider, even if you're not facing, a complicated law that's coming down the pipe like we are here in Colorado Springs. I think the specifics of our coming law in Colorado Springs here aren't that relevant, obviously, to agencies outside Colorado, but based on what we've kind of gone through, I'll offer just a couple of suggestions, and that is get involved with the process if you can, whether it's through your lobbyists, your professional associations, legislative liaisons, or what have you. Sometimes the best you can do is mitigate an unfavorable bill, but you can't have an impact in telling our story to legislators can make a difference. I think the role of law enforcement is to sort of bring a dose of real world reality to the conversation, because typically these bills are being drafted by police reform groups that don't have a real grasp of what the actual everyday impact will be on law enforcement agencies. Work together, don't write policies in a silo. There's a lot of great work like what Mike's been talking about that's out there on why you want something that's specific to your agency. Take advantage of all the great work and research that's already been done. And then lastly, once your policy is written, take some very specific measures to ensure that your officers truly understand it and can apply it. When they're facing consequences like our officers are going to face here in Colorado, I think it's incumbent upon agencies to make sure that they truly have a working knowledge of both the state law and of policy. And I think what we've got plans is specific training that will be required for all officers, and I think that's probably a good way to go. I'd like to touch on just for a couple of minutes the idea of where we've landed here in Colorado Springs with the kind of critical issue of when officers are authorized to view body-worn camera footage connected with internal investigations, and specifically here in Colorado Springs, we talk about deadly force incident. Again, probably an area of our policy we didn't do due diligence to when we first drafted it, and we've made several revisions since then, because obviously it's hugely important to officers, and careers can be impacted by how that policy is written and how these investigations turned out. As Mike mentioned, one of the common arguments you hear from officers is this shouldn't be a memory test. This should be about accuracy and about getting to the truth. And while I generally agree with that statement, it's not always that black and white, obviously. Our basic policy is that officers can watch their body-worn camera footage to prepare reports, testify in court, for investigative purposes, training, or what have you, but there's two exceptions: internal investigations and deadly force incidents like an officer-involved shooting. In internal investigations, our default policy is that officers are allowed to watch their body-worn camera footage prior to being interviewed. However, the supervisor involved in that can make the decision to jointly watch that body-worn camera footage with the officer. And in rare circumstances, the viewing can be prohibited based on what might be the complex nature of an internal investigation. But even that has to be authorized by a deputy chief or the commander of our professional standards division. Deadly force incidents are a little different circumstance. The default position of our policy is that officers are prohibited from viewing the video prior to the interview. Our position is that officers' recollection and perception of events are key elements in this type of an investigation. But we also recognize the fact that the nature of these incidents impacts an officer's ability to accurately perceive things. We've all heard about tunnel vision and sensory deprivation and hearing impairment and those kind of things. So our policy allows the officer the opportunity to watch the video after an initial interview. And if the video is viewed after the initial interview, then our policy mandates that the officer be allowed to continue to the interview and offer any clarifying information that they'd like to offer based on viewing the body-worn camera video with the investigators. For example, one of the things, I've been involved in a lot of those, and one of the things typically the officers don't know how many shots they fired. So our policy would allow the officer to say something along the lines of, well, my recollection is I fired 2 shots during that encounter, but after viewing the body-worn camera video, it's obvious I fired 6, or whatever the case might be. And so we think it's important that they be allowed to clarify information afterwards, because it's well established that they're not going to be able to perceive everything accurately during an incident like that. Of course, is all premised on the fact that the officer elects to be interviewed in the first place. Since a deadly force investigation here is potentially a criminal case, they certainly have the opportunity to decline to be interviewed, but in that case, they would not be allowed to watch the body-worn camera video. I think one of the points I just conclude with about that is our goal, I think, in writing that policy was not to paint ourselves into a corner. Those investigations, as you all know, are very complex, can take a lot of weird turns and twists. And if you have a policy that doesn't allow the people that are running that investigation to make exceptions to that policy, I think it can be difficult to have something that's workable. You're going to encounter situations that you just didn't anticipate and kind of have yourself in a corner. So those are the 2 things, Mike, that I kind of wanted to touch on in a little bit of detail that we were struggling with here in Colorado as far as our state law, and we continue to refine a lot of the areas that you talked about here. And again, I would just encourage folks out there to take advantage of what a lot of the other agencies have been doing for several years now. Take a look at their policies, work through it, look at the research, and I think you can write a better policy up front and maybe not have to write so many big revisions down the road like we did. Thank you.
All right, I think at this point, we'll kick it over to Inspector Ashe to offer her perspective.
Thanks so much, Michael. Really appreciate it. So I'm Inspector Cecilia Ashe. I am in charge of the Operations Division for Wilmington Police, which encompasses our criminal investigations, patrol, special operations, and other units such as that. So just a little history here for the city of Wilmington and kind of where we're at in the state of Delaware, which is this was a project that we started in 2016 here in the city of Wilmington with a pilot program. And with that, what we did in getting that initiated was really use strong resources at the time, like the BGA, toolkit that we used for body-worn cameras, which was, it helped us a great deal in getting a good foundation going. In 2017, we had a new chief of police come in, and we had to reprioritize some of the other things just because our violence was spiking. So we really did a lot of focus on driving crime down in the city. With that being said, in 2020, we started to begin looking at rolling into our operating costs. How do we do this? How do we get this body-worn camera program up and running? With that, we did apply for a grant through BGA and were awarded that grant. And just, recapping real quick, just some of the things that we've gone through with BGA in that process. I think I went into it fearful of how difficult is this process going to be, getting the feds to sign off on a policy or procedure. What I found was it was very easy. We were able to meet with our technical assistance provider to kind of guide us on the policies that we had in place, and really just focusing on those 13 main mandatory ones and just seeing the flexibility of BGA and some of these consultants looking at giving us national best standards. Where that also is very helpful is when you're engaging in the community and public and political officials of sitting there and saying, hey, look, this isn't just a policy that we wrote, from an officer perspective, but this is national best standards that are researched and where the priorities lie, not only with the federal government in body-worn camera standards, but also what are researchers showing are the priorities in these policies. So for us, it was very easy. I want to say within probably 2 to 3 weeks of us getting the grant, we were able to get authorized for the release of those funds. With that, once we went through that release, we were able within 30 days of receiving the equipment, actually a total of 29, to get the entire department. We have a department of 319 officers. So in approximately 29 days, we were able to train and equip all of the officers on the policy and getting the cameras out onto the street, which was very well received by the community and city council, because they also had fears that maybe there was going to be a lot of red tape through the federal grant process. So that was a huge win for us. In addressing some of the challenges that we faced was having the community have a strong understanding that this is not just something, this isn't an easy and a quick fix. You can't just throw cameras on officers and put them out on the street. They have to have a strong understanding of what the policies and procedures are. And in our department, just like Mark's, we wear cameras. It's not required for police chiefs or, people in my position as a deputy chief to wear cameras unless we are engaging with the public. In 2021, in July, Delaware State passed a law saying that all police officers will wear cameras under those circumstances if they are engaging the community. So in some departments in the state, chiefs aren't wearing them. In our department, we believe in the philosophy that if we're going to require our officers to do it, we're going to do it ourselves as well. And I think my only piece of advice to anybody that's getting ready to implement this process is when you, from a leadership perspective, you have to be engaged with the officers. I attended every single training session so that if the officers had questions, they could be answered by the top officials who oversaw the program. One of the other things that I encourage people to do is have a strong understanding of what's required every day to make the program successful. And what I mean by that is, if you are looking at implementing this type of program into your department, what I would suggest and what we did here in the city of Wilmington is look at the auditing process, what's going to be required, within your policies. We have very strong auditing policies. And so it was my position with city council that we had to have a supervisor overseeing this program in addition to 3 officers. So we developed a unit, it's called our technical resource unit, that oversees body-worn cameras and other digital evidence. And with that, I'll just touch on some of the laws here in the state of Delaware and then go into the audit process. So in covering some of the things that Michael went over, in the state of Delaware, we are a one-party consent state. However, we do encourage our officers in our policy to inform people that they're being audibly and visually recorded. Officers have the discretion not to disclose that, but again, we like to give them that discretion as it is a one-party consent state. In dealing with the activation, our policy is written that anytime you're engaging in any type of law enforcement action where you believe that you're going to have to take some type of law enforcement action is where we require the officers to activate. We do allow our supervisors to review body-worn cameras, and we do allow our officers to review them as well. In our audit process with the 319, this wasn't a perfect process in the beginning. We've definitely had to adjust. And to Michael's recommendation, we review our body-worn camera policy every 6 months. We're constantly reviewing it every day, but we typically put out updates unless there's some type of legal challenge to it. We put out updates almost every 6 months if there's something that needs to be changed. In our audit process, what we do here in the city of Wilmington is we audit all 319 officers in an average of every 2 weeks. And the way we do that is we do it by alphabetical order of the officers, and we do it in a multi-layered strategy. The first being that we will review the officers that are coming off of shift the following day. So for example, if you have a platoon working yesterday, we're reviewing their body-worn cameras of the officers that are working. And we also relay to the TRU or Technical Resource Unit, those that are out on FMLA, those that are out on military or vacation schedules, so that they're not reviewing people that aren't even technically here. So what we do is the officers will pull the CAD calls for service and review and match whether the officers are recording. If they're initiating a recording, we look at whether, we look at the number of calls for service. We look at how the officers are tagging, just because of our retention laws here in the state. Different types of calls for service can be retained for different periods. So that's very important here. And we also look at how long it takes for the officer to upload or dock their camera. And we require officers to do it at the end of every shift and to tag all of their videos by the end of the shift. One of the other things that we're doing right now, and we have Axion as our product, so it's just using specific examples of what we do with them. We not advertising their product per se. But what we do as a secondary layer is to also look at Axion performance, which gives us the ability to audit from a different perspective of compliance. And it really helps us streamline things. We look at whether there's compliance in recording, appropriate activation. At times, just recently, we noticed that officers engaged in foot pursuits or uses of force. And what ends up happening is they don't have time to activate their camera, or they've activated it after the arrest has taken place. We initially started our buffering process at 30 seconds. We now are at 2 minutes prior to an incident. And that's really to be able to protect the officers. And we thought we were going to get some pushback from them on that, but I think that they see that it's very beneficial and it takes the worry off of them. We also use the ability of Bluetoothing so that if one camera is activated, it then activates all the other cameras that are within that area. And we also send an alert out to the officers so that they're aware that their camera's been activated. But when we're conducting these audits, we're also looking to see that officers are deactivating their cameras at the appropriate time. And again, just looking at how do we categorize these things. So again, we worked through this with our FOP because we are under contract here, union contract in the state of Delaware. And overall, the officers are happy that they have the cameras. I thought we were going to get big pushback from the officers, but that's not the case. The other thing that we've also noticed too is a significant decrease in citizens' complaints. Some would say that that's tied to the fact that officers are making people aware that they're being recorded. But I just really find that, I think it's about having faith in your department and your community, believing in you and what the officers do day in, day out, and the struggles that we have in law enforcement today. So I will turn it back over to Michael on that to see if there's any specific questions or anything else you needed me to hit on.
Thank you very, very much to both of our presenters. Quinn, I don't see any questions in the chat. Or Tom, have we gotten any? I know we're running a little short on time, so if not, we can certainly just kick it over to John.
No, Mike, we haven't gotten any questions in the chat. So John, if you want to go ahead and start posing some questions or make some remarks, that'd be great. And anybody in the audience, if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to put them in.
Well, I can have a ton of observations here. Again, I'm John Markovic. I run the body-worn camera program, the grant program, and oversee the TTA by CNA, Mike and his team and others. And I think one thing that we definitely noticed, it's pretty obvious that BWC technology, the practice, the sort of the ecosystem of body-worn cameras has evolved over the last 7 years. So not surprisingly, Mike's presentation attests to how some of these changes have been manifested in policy. Yet we see, and what we really believe in, is that the policy should be dictated by local circumstances, by stakeholder input, obviously impacted by state laws, which are becoming more common, not just the mandatory use of body-worn cameras in some states, but states are increasingly dictating elements of policy or setting laws that affect policy. So I think we've kept with our mission to not be prescriptive, but I think understand how things are evolving. And I think definitely our two presenters, Mark and Inspector Ashe, I think, underscored many of those things in sort of, I think, real world compelling examples. I think Mark talked about the broad stakeholder impact, and I think really touched on in very real terms the unintended impact of state legislations on cost, operations, and burdens that sometimes occur. And there's certainly, I think, his advice to be aware of and proactive and try to get ahead of the curve is really interesting. And I like the legal terms he threw out were intriguing, and I think it attests to the fact that the climate has changed with depolicing and defunding and activist groups. And I think his remarks about trying to mediate some of those in very planful and ways, in cooperative ways, are spot on. Inspector Ashe, it's great to see you again. We worked together many years ago on the Violence Reduction Network, so I'm really great to see you flourishing with the Real-Time Crime Center. And then just how much that the Wilmington Police Department has embraced body-worn cameras and quickly have come up to speed with that. I think the fact that you underscored the broad stakeholder input from the community, from the union, so forth, really kind of speaks to the holistic approach that we try to implement with our body-worn camera program. So it certainly, I think, in the comments you made about how Wilmington deploys cameras, everyone from the chief down, how some other agencies within the state have elected not to do that, speaks to the issue that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. But as Mike and Mark and you have pointed, I think there are evolving standards, and the analysis that Mike's done has helped sort of point out where the trends are going. One of the last things I mentioned is just there's a tremendous number of interdependencies here. When legislation changes, it changes the burdens on not just the law enforcement agencies, but on prosecutors and others, particularly if the retention periods are increased or if laws are changed to promote release of body-worn cameras. I think it's interesting to note that, again, being attentive to local circumstances, and Mike mentioned sort of the open records approach in California. We saw the opposite in North Carolina, or we're seeing the opposite, where their legislation, despite some reform efforts, are still restricting the release of body-worn camera, and it requires a judge's order to release the body-worn camera. Even if the local police chief wants to share that video, he or she would be hard-pressed to do that. I think under current North Carolina law, that may have changed. There were some efforts at reform. So it's very much evolving, and I think these presentations pointed that out very well. So I don't know if we've got any questions that have come in since I've been talking.
No questions right now.
John?
Yes.
John, this is Tom. I'm getting feedback, sorry. Well, that's me. Since my closing is literally 30 seconds, I have a question if I can ask Mark, and it's kind of putting on you on the spot, Mark, not to have you be an expert on pending legislation, but from my experience in being a police officer in the past, it sounds like this could be challenging and go to the health and wellness of officers as well, when the presumption of guilt or ill intent is going to be there with inactivation. So do you anticipate the need for increased training, hyper training to add to this? And then I don't want to go into scenarios, but the case where there are multiple officers on an investigation or a scene, and one does not activate, but there is footage based on the others, will the same standard be in place with the legislation to hold that one officer accountable or deemed as being, how'd you phrase it? Well, not being intentionally wrong, if you can respond to that. And I know it's a tough question.
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I think one of the bottom line answer to your initial question is yes. Really, our legislature here in Colorado focused on two things: use of force and then body-worn cameras. And use of force portion of the statutes are already in effect. And we did very, very specific training. In fact, it was mandated by state law, by state statute, that officers be trained in certain things. And I would certainly anticipate that we would do something very similar with respect to the body-worn camera provisions that are coming next year. Because you correctly noted that our officers are very, very concerned about some of these provisions and the impact that it could have on them for inadvertent failures to activate and other activities. And the real answer is we don't have agreement, not only within our city, but across the state, on what the impact will be. I think we have to see how it plays out in court, what some of the judicial rulings are on some of the situations that we're going to encounter, because the statute is frankly ambiguous in a lot of situations, and we aren't even sure how to comply in some specific situations. So it's going to be an interesting year, and my hope is that perhaps the legislature will be open to some revisions and clarifications as some of this starts to play out next year.
Thank you, Mark. John, did you have anything else?
No, well, I think I was going to ask a similar question, and I think Mark sort of addressed it, whether I think one of the things that's, dare I use the word refreshing, about body-worn cameras is it seems to be that there's near universal acceptance. As Inspector Ashe mentioned, the officers were pretty receptive to body-worn cameras. Maybe there was some anticipated resistance. I wonder whether some of this will change if some of the laws that Mark said are forthcoming. And I may not have the term exactly here, but the rebuttable presumption of inadmissibility, I think, and the permissive inference of misconduct, if those come into play, I could see that officers may be a little more skeptical of body-worn cameras if those come to fruition. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves and how that may vary by states and localities. I don't know, Mark, if you have any insights on what officers are expressing about those laws now, or administrators.
I think what the officers are the most frustrated about is, and this, I'll state this is kind of my opinion on it, but it seems that the statutes were drafted from a position that officers are liars, and that's sort of presumed. When you say that the camera wasn't turned on, and in statute it's codified that the reason that wasn't done is to cover up misconduct, as opposed to some heroic or appropriate action by an officer who just made a mistake. Yes, they don't like it. It's frustrating. I think it's disheartening to them, but it is what we face. And obviously it doesn't relieve us as a law enforcement agency of writing a coherent policy that they can follow, that keeps them in accordance with state law and making sure they understand it. And so that's the challenge we will face here in Colorado over the next several months, and work through that process. And like I said, I just hope that our legislators are open to clarifications or practical things that we're able to bring to their attention that they might be willing to modify down the road.
Thank you. Well, I just do want to thank our panel for a really good discussion. I think that when you hear from a researcher on analysis and then practitioners in the field with real life experience, it just can't help but benefit us in the policing industry. So as we're wrapping up now, just want to extend on behalf of our team our thanks to BJA, Bureau of Justice Assistance, for its investment in the body-worn camera grant program and in all the range of technical assistance and training like this webinar that they provide opportunities for police and other agencies around the country. So I also want to thank in particular Quinn Patterson and the CNA team for the behind the scenes efforts that went into facilitating and coordinating this webinar. We hope you found it valuable, and we appreciate any feedback, and thank you all to everyone, and hope all stay safe. So thank you.